All right, recording in progress. So we're going to pick up where we left off. We're talking a little bit about the file format that Arnold uses, that we will be using in our class when we output for rendering, and that is this OpenEXR half. Now, the difference between half and full is half is 16 bits per channel. Full is 32 bits per channel. Now, to give you an idea of what that means, most images that you get off of the internet are basically, hang on a second, let me share my screen because I'm sure I am recording a blank video. Share, there we go. Hopefully that's working. Okay, so half, 16 bits per channel, full, or they call float, is 32 bits. Images off the internet are traditionally called 24-bit images. Now, it's a little confusing, but 24-bit images are basically 3 channels, red, green, and blue. Each channel has 8 bits of information per channel. What does that mean in real world terms? 8 bits of information is equivalent to about 256 shades of gray between absolute black and absolute white. All right, so 8 bits per channel gives you that. So if we have 16 bits, let's go down and do the math here. And why don't I just add 256 times 2? That would give me 512, but that's not actually how it works. When you're talking about information like this, you're talking about square roots. So not to frighten anybody, but 256 squared, that's 16 bits per channel. So let's see, what would that come out to be? So it comes out to be roughly 65,000 bits of information per channel rather than just 256. So that's a difference between a 24-bit or 8 bits per channel image. And remember, 8 bits of information for red, 8 for green, 8 for blue. That 8 times 3 is 24. That's how they come up with 24 bits for normal, average, ordinary images off the web. JPEGs, PNGs, TIFFs, Targas, whatever they are. That gives us roughly 16.5 million colors. Our eyes can see that as what's called a continuous tone, meaning we really don't see all the steps and variations when you have that many color variations that you can have. The more bits per channel, the smoother the transition between black and white and color. That means you've got more pixels you can deal with inside, technically, more bits of information. So that's why using half EXR is totally fine for us. 32-bit would be good for something like a 4K image where you've got 4,000 pixels in there. 4K image is 4096 by 4096 or 2556, whatever it is. Depends on the aspect ratio. Most of us use a widescreen aspect ratio, so it's always wider than it is higher. So consequently, 16-bit works perfectly good for us. And the biggest we're going to be rendering in our class is going to be what's called half HD. We're going to be doing 960 wide by 540 tall. Full HD for most purposes would be what's technically called Blu-ray, which is 1080 or 1920 wide by 1080 high. We're doing half of that just to save some render time. Remember, we got little laptops here. We had full production facility, we'd probably be going 4K at least, but we're not. Little laptops, lots of heat, fan goes on all the time. They tend to burn out a lot if you do that to them too much. Now, not to say that these are delicate, they will handle lots of rendering, but they are just not meant to be workstations, which is if you're in a production facility and you're rendering out big frames with lots of information, you're going to be using not just your desktop, but servers, dedicated computers to crunching rendering. All right, so does that make sense? So that's why we use half. So 24-bit, all of our images are going to be RGB channels, red, green, and blue. We combine those three together. That's what gives us our 16.5 million colors. We'll get into more about red, green, and blue because that's our primary display and receptor function that we have in our eyes too. Our eyes have what are called cones, and there are red, green, and blue cones that are responsive to those bandwidths of color, and that's how we see different colors. Those three colors together can combine and give us all the color variations that we see. When we talk about image size, we are always talking about the width of the image and then the height, width by height. So 960 by 540, 960 wide, 540 high. If you say just plain like HD 1080, that always means 1920 wide, 1080 high, or HD 720, which is 1260 by 720. Now, resolution, that is basically how many pixels can we cram into a given size. Anybody's familiar with going out trying to buy a television or a TV, or, you know, now they're entertainment centers because they're internet and traditional TV and gaming, and they're just more than dumb TVs that just get a signal from some outside source. But if you ever try and go out and buy a TV now, it's really hard to find one that's not 4K. In fact, they're getting harder to find 4K because they're pushing 6K, 5K, 6K, 8K. That's 8,000 pixels per inch. Which means very, very, very tiny little LEDs or LCDs or display pixels, whatever they happen to be. So just giving you a little idea, it makes sense, right? We already decided or talked about the fact that the shape of pixels are square. They're like Lego blocks. They make great straight lines, right angles. You want to make a curve or a diagonal, they're not so good for that. They create stair steps. So the more of those pixels that you have, the less of that stair stepping feature we notice. Things start to look a little more natural. They start to look a little more curvy. To give you an idea, Anybody ever watch TV, like old TV, maybe when you were very, very young, that the TV wasn't necessarily flat, it might have been curved? Like I grew up in that era. And you put your hand on it and you could feel like the radiation, it was like, okay, that is analog television. Analog television is 640 by 480 resolution. Now, you could get some pictures that were really big, but that's still the resolution of the screen. It would just blow it up bigger. Now, we moved into what's called digital broadcast around the 1990s. Mid-1990s, we converted all analog broadcast signals to digital. And in the swap over, we got a few extra things. We got a little more resolution. We went from 640 by 480 to 720 by 486, 480, 405, depending on your TV. Because we took big, giant analog broadcast signals, which were many feet, some of them in size, not visible to us, and then we shrunk them down into zeros and ones into a very narrow area. So we gained a little more resolution. This resolution right here, this was also our first digital video broadcast, or I should say digital video format that we could watch at home, DVD. Now, we always think of DVD, well, at least I did at the time, DVDs was the bomb. I mean, that was much better than, if anybody's ever seen VHS tape. They are, so yeah, I had some until about 3 years ago. I finally got rid of it because I'm never buying another tape machine again. But no, I don't miss the fact that after the first time you watch it, the quality starts to fade. You put it near anything magnetic and it scrambles the signal. The tape gets stuck in the machine. I mean, don't miss any of that. So from there, we moved to DVD discs, right? Now, pretty much it's hard to even find those. I mean, you can find them, you can find Blu-ray discs, but everything is streaming now. Everything you can pretty much get on demand somewhere. Or if you have it, you can probably get a digital copy and keep it on your computer or your hard drive. That way there are basically no moving parts. So from DVD, we went to HD, first generation. That lasted a couple years. That was HD 720, not even a couple years. And right behind it was Blu-ray, 1080. There was this whole high definition HD DVD versus Blu-ray, Sony versus Microsoft, SmackDown, Deathmatch. You know, this round, Sony won. And if anybody was ever familiar, well, this is kind of getting really old and nerdy, but in the old days when there was tape, there was VHS, and there was also something called Betamax. Betamax was a superior videotape process, but the standard at the time became VHS. And Sony was upset about that because they wanted their Betamax to be the industry standard. So when the second round came around between DVD and HDVD, they basically dumped Blu-ray on the market as much as they could to make that the standard. And they kind of won. Now, the next round, well, there's 4K. That's going to be nobody's standard because the industry has taken over and said, hey, you know what? Digital video is now digital video. It's going to be high resolution. We're going to have HD aspect ratio probably for as long as we can foresee, because films have been shot in HD for decades. You know, what were they called? Panavision or CinemaScope. Oh, they were just HD formats, really wide, not quite as tall. And that's what they would show at theaters. Some of the screens were curved, some were flat. It didn't really matter. But that aspect ratio really defined modern HD for us anyway. So just to give you an idea, old school 35 millimeter film, that's the stuff that they actually shot on celluloid. And 35 millimeter is the size of the frame and not the focal length of the camera lens. That is basically 2K video when it's scanned in. And even when we were doing celluloid film, it was still scanned in and digitally distributed. So now, everything, nobody uses film anymore, really, unless you're trying to go for a specific look or a nostalgia. But honestly, you can get that in post-production with compositing filters. You can put film grain on it. You can put, you know, all kinds of sepia tones in it to get that look of old school chemical blending to process negatives. But that was equivalent to a 2K, which is 2048 by 1556. All right, now, we already talked about our pixel aspect ratio, which is square pixels being like Lego blocks. So in order to kind of compensate for that in early CG, an algorithm or a program was developed to basically approximate, to fill in or interpolate the information that the path or edge of an object would be determined, and they would apply, basically blur it or smooth it out. This is called anti-aliasing. And anti-aliasing is basically just an approximation to kind of go, all right, what kind of pixel would fill in here to make it look smoother? What about in here? What about here? The whole idea is to make it look like it is a smooth transition from one corner to the other corner in the frame. Now, all modern renderers and even displays like Maya's viewport has anti-aliasing turned on automatically to make the edges look smooth. Without it, you can kind of see everything looks a little bit grainy, or it looks a little bit jagged on the edges. It's almost like the difference between when you create a sphere, it usually is displayed in Maya in one mode, right? And then you hit 3 and it looks a lot smoother. Well, anti-aliasing is sort of like that, but not quite. It's visually like that, but it doesn't do under the hood all the stuff that hitting the 3 key does, which approximates 2 levels of smoothing with mesh enhancement. All right, does that make sense? All right, so let's get in and talk a little bit about Arnold. And then we'll talk about the assignment. And there's a couple things I want to go over also, because there are a couple of parts of your assignment that you get a chance to be a little creative with, and we're going to provide you with some information that will hopefully help that. All right, so it's still starting up. I got the pinwheel of death. There we go. All right, so we kind of went over how to check your version of Maya, how to check the version of Arnold that we have. You want to make sure you're using Arnold 4.2.4. And the reason you want to do that is because, let me open up the Arnold render view, which is this icon here in the Arnold shelf. Looks like an eyeball. and it looks like a little render view or a film frame. So when I click on that, that brings up the Arnold render view. Now it's different than this render view up here. This is basically Maya's render view. So I got that by clicking up here in the tool shelf, or actually the tools that are underneath the main menus. But in the Arnold shelf, this is the icon we use. And if you're using a version of Arnold that is before 4.2.1.1, you will not have this tab right here called Post. This tab is what allows us to use a bunch of what they call imagers. And the imager that we use is the denoiser, and they've got a cute name for it called noise. So it's the denoiser noise. That basically allows us to smooth out our renders without having to put an unbelievable amount of samples in our scene. So you can add it, you can click on it and remove it. And it's all here under that little gear icon. Right, now, once you've got the Arnold render view open, obviously this little button right here will activate rendering. Right now, I've got an empty scene. I've got no lights in it. If I hit the render button, I get exactly what I have in my scene. Remember, you need 3 objects. You need 3 things to make something visible. Right now, I've only got one of the 3. I've got a camera. How do I know? Well, because my camera is called perspective. I've got a camera, but I have no object and I have no light, so I will see nothing. Now, I could have an object in my scene. Hit render, I'm still not going to see anything because I've got a camera, I've got an object, but I'm still missing one other thing, light. Without that, I can't see anything. All right. So before I go too much further in Maya, let's kind of go over what you're going to be doing in lab today. Because once we get started in Maya, it's going to be easy to pull up those scenes that you're going to be working on and be able to render and see what happens and be able to explain it a little bit better, and it will make sense. All right, so activity 1, we are basically providing you with 2 scenes. You've got a daytime scene and a nighttime scene. Your job is to render out one of the daytime scenes, one of the nighttime scenes, and get the quality of your render to match the reference that we provide. This is your target. This is how your render should look. Now, whole idea is we provide you with a scene file that has 4 camera angles in it. You pick one of them. That will become your first part of your project. One of these 4. They've got names on them. They're basically, establishing, long shot, and a couple of close-ups. Then you're going to choose one nighttime scene. These are all pre-lit. The cameras are already there. All you're doing is trying to render it out and figure out how rendering works, how you can get the best quality for the least amount of time. Then, once you've done the daytime scene, the nighttime scene, you will then go and do a composition based on one of our scenes. Your choice, doesn't matter. one of our scenes, make a composition based on reference you find on the internet. And what that means is you are basically going to use our geometry as stand-in or just as a layout to get the look and feel of the reference you find on the internet. It's not about modeling. It's not about lighting. It's all about composition and all about look and feel. Do your objects give the impression of what the staging is like in your reference? Did you find an appropriate position to render from so that the lighting sort of matches what your reference is? And that's just it. You're not going to light this. This is not a lighting exercise. You're not going to change lights, but you are free to move, duplicate, translate, scale the geometry that we give you. You just can't model anything or bring anything in from an outside source. Now, to kind of help you with visualizing that a little better, let's take a look at what some of the previous classes have done. And by the way, if anybody gives me anything really good, you'll probably be in next month's Hall of Fame that we show off. All right. So the whole idea of this is to find reference of something that inspires you, that gives you, it makes you want to do this. So nighttime scene, got a monster under the bed. We have a bedroom scene. Makes great sense. We have a nighttime scene. There's two. And then put some geometry under the bed, basically to act as a stand-in for the monster. We've got some computer lights. We've got an amp light in the scene at night. They're turned on. And basically, you're trying to get the look and feel of the reference. This one, overhead shot. This is Woody on Andy's bed looking at Buzz. Get some of the geometry, rearrange it, make it sort of look like Woody. Now, you can be as simplistic as you want. And all of this is either duplicated geometry or it's taken from another shape and scale. Obviously, bedroom scenes work really well because it is an indoor room scene that you've got. This one, I honestly like this just because they kind of went down on the floorboards of the room, put the camera in an area where there's light coming in through the window, and they were able to kind of mimic the vanishing point of this street. You can clearly see the light is down here. We've got vanishing lines here. It's staged very closely to the reference. So, like I said, could be a simplistic, a couple of boxes or a duplicated computer. You can put as much work in as you want. These are actually the computer, a computer mouse that's on the table, duplicated a couple times. Like I said, you could be as simple or as complex as you want. This is fairly simple. Camera under the bed, couple of those are like empty soda bottles. This is the floor duplicated twice, got some, rectangle shapes from the room stacked up. Simple shot. Fairly simple, but you get the idea. All right, does that make sense? Does that help to be able to see what other people have done? Any questions about that?
So we're finding, you said one daytime scene and one nighttime scene?
Yeah, you're going to pick. We got 4 daytime scenes here. You're going to pick one of those, render that. You're going to pick one of the night times, and then you're going to get a chance to do your own composition. Whichever reference you have, if you've got reference during the day or you've got reference that has a nighttime look, just choose the appropriate scene that would work for you for that.
Are we choosing the same reference that we chose for the daytime and nighttime scene? Or is it-
No. The daytime scene we provide you, these are your reference images. We provide you with those. This is done already. You're going to choose one of these. You're going to choose one of these, and then you're going to go on the internet and find your own reference for the My Composition portion. We call it the My Comp. No? Does it make sense?
It does.
So here, this was gotten off the internet. They used the nighttime scene and rearranged the geometry to get the look and feel of that.
Okay, I guess the question was, for your scenes, do we have to pull that from the same scene that we chose for the render for the daytime and nighttime? Or do we choose a different scene from that? From those options?
Okay, I understand your question. I didn't understand it before. This is all the same scene. The difference is we have a camera in there that has 4 different camera angles in it. You're choosing one of the camera angles in that scene.
Oh,
So I guess what I didn't understand in your question was you were thinking these were all separate scenes. It's all one scene file, and inside there are 4, they're basically called bookmarks for a camera.
okay.
You just go to the bookmark of the one you want to do. Now, for my composition, suppose you choose a daytime, you found daytime reference. You would use this scene as a starting point, but you would make your own camera, rearrange your geometry so that it looks and is staged like your reference.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Okay,
thought
that's what I
there
thought.
were like 4 different scenes that we could choose from.
Gotcha.
rather than the 4 different-
Yeah, it's honestly, this is just an exercise in, this is interior daytime lighting, and it's the same scene, the same lighting, it's just 4 different angles, and that's what it looks like. Okay, I understand now. That's a good question. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions about that part? So, and here's the way those bookmarks work. So when you open the scene up, you'll be in what's called the render cam. We created a special camera. It's in there. And in that render cam, if you go up into the view menu in the viewport, there are bookmarks for that camera. That camera contains the 16mm, the 35, the 24, the 70. So here is the 16, here's the 35, here's the 24, here's the 70. Now, the reason that they all have different names is because part of this exercise, which we will get to after we do the rendering demo part and kind of go over how rendering works, is creating a camera. You guys are going to now create a camera, and I want you to start being conscious of what am I seeing in my reference. The camera that was used to create the reference had what's called a focal length on the camera lens. Anybody here ever do photography? Okay, so a focal length is basically how the camera sees the scene based on the glass in the lens. And there are 4 different lens types that all have different qualities and different looks, which we'll get to in a little bit. And that little tutorial should give you an idea of, okay, I'm looking at this. My scene looks, let me go back to some of the reference here. Yeah. Where's it at? Where's the snail one? Right here. All right, so you see how the monitor on the computer looks really big close to the camera, but then it kind of gets, it looks like it stretches and gets smaller. That's because the focal length that was used is a lower focal length, which causes that distortion. So in the reference, the student said, yep, I'm kind of seeing that, and I want to try and get that same effect. So each camera lens category has a different visual property, which we'll go over. So if you have any questions after we go over that part, let me know, because that's something that I don't think you have gotten in any other classes. And that's something that personally I find important if you're going to try and match reference that's given to you. Now, as a modeler, did they have you guys look at focal length or take a look at the reference and try to open it in Photoshop and see if you could tell what kind of camera was used and what kind of lens? Okay, because it makes a difference. Like in Maya, every time you create a Maya scene, it has what's called a 35mm camera. All the Maya cameras are 35mm, which means it's like a traditional just point and shoot camera that you would go buy that doesn't have any kind of zoom or anything. So consequently, if you're not aware that there are different camera lenses, when you get reference from a photographer who might be using all these different kinds of camera lenses and types to get a certain visual effect, you may be stuck trying to model your stuff to match it, but you may realize that, wait a minute, I'm actually modeling I'm modeling distortion in when it's not really the scene that's distorted, it's the actual lens that's doing that. Because if you're not careful, you model something that has like a weird perspective, just like that TV, and you may model that, but in reality, it's just a rectangle. So just stuff to keep in mind, whether you're a modeler, whether you're an animator, whether you're look development, just in general as an artist, it's good to know all that stuff, because even if you want to do it traditionally with paper and pencil, you can, as long as you know what you're doing and how to get that. All right, so the idea is you're going to pick out one of those scenes based on whichever one you want to try. Like I said, daytime, nighttime, there's a render cam in each scene. Now, there are two different scenes. There's a daytime scene, nighttime scene, obviously, because the lighting's different, has to be a different scene file. So different camera angles, different looks. All right, now, the download section right here, this will give you basically a folder that contains 3 different folders. Your Maya project folder, which says my project 1, Maya, project Arnold. This is what you set your Maya project to when you are in Maya. This folder that says PSD template, this is where you will put your render in underneath the reference we provide. Your objective is to get your render to match the quality of the reference as close as possible. This is your baseline quality. If you go higher, that's great, but this would be acceptable. Now, to get you guys thinking about time versus quality, you're going to be taking some measurements. And those measurements are going to be, well, how many samples did I use? What did I have? What setting did I have to use on my denoiser to get it to look good, and how long did it take to render. And then you're going to be putting in your name, which is last name, first name, and then year, month, which is for the year, we'll use 21 and it'll be 12 for the month. Now you would say, okay, but suppose I choose to not do that scene. Well, that's where in Photoshop, there are different layers for that reference. So in Photoshop, under the layers section, go under render, go down to the reference images, and you'll see there's day 1, 2, 3, and 4. Right now, day 1 is covering up the other reference images. You just turn off the ones that you're not using and just leave the one on that you are. Same thing with the nighttime scene. There are 4 different nighttime reference images. And your render goes under here. One word of caution, at least for me anyway, Photoshop and Maya, they're both memory hogs. So if you're working in Maya and you're not using Photoshop, quit out of Photoshop, it'll help your rendering. If you're in Photoshop and not using Maya, quit out of Maya, use Photoshop. Because Photoshop requires at least as much memory as the image you open. And when you open an image, Photoshop always allocates twice as much memory to use as what's called a buffer. So when you make changes, you can see it happen. So consequently, they both suck the living life out of you. If you want to crash your computer, the best thing you can do is run all that stuff at one time. And then try to stream a game or watch a video or play a game. Anything that's going to steal resources, doesn't matter. All right, so reference images. These are the individual images, and they're here for you to be able to use and bring into Arnold so that you can look at your render and compare it immediately to how the render reference looks. All right, so what I'm going to do is I've got Maya running. I'm going to set my project here. You can see I've got 2 scene files. What I'm going to do is, well, let me get rid of that. That's garbage. So let's go File, Set Project. I know I've got my stuff in Downloads. There's Project 1 SAL Arnold. I want to open that up. And I want to click on my Maya project folder, which is this one. If I open it up, you'll see all the subfolders here. Let me go back a level because I don't want to select any subfolders. I'm just going to select the main folder and go Set. Now, what that did under the hood, if anybody cares, is this little file right here called workspace.mel. This tells Maya, because Maya's reading this, and this little file says to Maya, all of the resources that you need for this project folder are here in this project. So when I go File, Open, it will take me automatically into my project folder, Scenes folder. And now I can choose my daytime scene. Don't save. Let's open it up. Give it a couple seconds, and there it is. Now, by default, it will open up in wireframe. Honestly, it's in wireframe because you don't really need to play around with what it looks like in shaded mode. This is all about rendering. And it will display a lot quicker if you are in wireframe rather than in shaded. So I always go back to 4, which is wireframe. Now, notice that the camera is not locked. You can move it around. You can do all kinds of unnaturally weird things. So how do you get back since you're in the render cam? Like I could go back to perspective 1, perspective, go back to render cam. It doesn't reset my camera. This is why we have bookmarks. Go under view, bookmarks, and there's your very first shot, which is basically this one right here. So if I go to my second bookmark, down here, 35 millimeter, that's this one. The 24 is going to be the overhead of the computer. And then there's one last one that's kind of a medium shot. It's basically the chair, the amp, radiator, this little corner right here. So you just decide which one visually looks interesting to you. I'm going to choose this one just because. Actually, somebody else want to pick one? It doesn't matter to me. Bottom right, this one. All right, so that happens to be this one. So yes, I like that. So now what you want to do is you've got it open. I always recommend save as. Why? You don't want to damage the original file if something happens in Maya, which Maya is notorious for. So file save as, you make a working copy. Also, this helps if you're getting work from a client, because the last thing you want to do is go, yeah, remember that big scene you gave me? Well, Maya got corrupted and it corrupted the scene. You go, you know, it's tough to make people understand that there's nothing wrong with their file. It's just something happened on your end. If you could get a new version of the scene, everything would be good. Why go through all that drama when you can just make a copy when you first get it, work on the copy. That way, if anything happens, go back to the original. So save as, we give you an MB. Watch what happens if I try to save this file as an MA. It says it contains unknown nodes. That's because Maya, in the student version that we all have, does not like it for you to take an MA file or an MB file and put it in the opposite format. It's got to stay in the original format, which since we gave you an MB, you got to resave it as an MB. So now if I go back, save as, let's change it from ASCII to binary, 2021-12, save, rainbows, unicorns, moonbeams. All right, so we got a working copy. Now, first thing you want to do is find out what does this scene look like if I just hit the render button, because right now it's got default everything. The only thing we did was light it, put materials on it so it displays. So I'm going to open up the Arnold render view and notice at the top here, there is an area for the cameras. So you want to make sure render cam shape is chosen and then hit the little render button. And it may take a few seconds for it to render because what it's doing is building the image that's outside the window. It's building that so it doesn't have to reprocess it every time. All right, so this is what it looks like by default. So these are the default render settings that you get from Arnold, that you get from Maya. And that's what you see. Wasn't bad. It took like 31 seconds. Now, let's talk a little bit about what we're looking at in this scene and how do I start figuring out what I need to do to make it better. So there's a couple of things you need to know. One is that areas like this is indirect light. Meaning there's light coming in through the windows, it's bouncing around the scene and eventually making its way over to this area. Areas like this is direct light. Meaning there's a light outside the sun, it streams in through the window, hits that geometry, I can see it in the camera. Notice the difference between the quality here, where you see a lot of light, not talking about the shadowy areas that are the window pane frame areas, but this area, notice there's virtually no noise in this area. Compare it to one of these shadowy indirect areas here. Lots of noise and grain in there. Does everybody see that? Now, the reason it looks like this is because indirect light or bounce light is harder to calculate than direct light. Remember, it's all about light coming in, hits an object, trying to find the camera. Here, it found the camera really quickly. It made a couple of passes and it found the camera, and it basically, it's really not going to get much better than this the more times I render it. I mean, this shadowy window pane area would look better, but the direct light here is virtually got no noise in it. The light that's actually hitting the top of this bedspread. Does that make sense? This is really important in Arnold because we have two parameters that we're going to look at. One is basically the overall sampling for the scene, and the other is the indirect light. And the reason we have those two settings is most renderers know it takes a lot more samples to make indirect areas look clean than it does direct light. All right, so to help us with this issue, there are a few tools that we need to play around with in Arnold. Now, before I talk about that, there's one thing you need to make sure. And I've noticed this happening. There's a shortcut key that people hit. I've done it to myself. It happens 2 or 3 times a month with students. This right here under view, where it says enable AOVs. If this is turned off, like right now it's turned off, and I go to render, nothing happened. It doesn't even refresh itself. Close that. Let's render again. Yeah, nothing happens. What you want to do is make sure that's turned on. AOVs, by the way, are actually technically, they're called arbitrary output variables. They're basically just parameters of what you're trying to render. And the only AOV we have here is called the beauty, which means it's the entire scene that's trying to display. So if that's not enabled, it's not going to refresh your screen. You may get it completely black. Like most of the time this happens if I open this scene again. Let me open up the default scene. Well, let me open up the one I just made again. Let's not save it. Don't save. Continue. All right, so you'll notice one thing. Arnold always remembers, as long as you've got Maya open, it remembers the last thing you rendered. So it remembered that I had AOVs on. So let me open up this other scene, the default scene. Let's open this up, turn off AOVs, and hit render. Nothing's going to happen. So if you're rendering and either it stays completely blank or nothing updates, make sure you've got AOVs enabled right here at the very top under view. All right, let's go back to the scene we were working on. That's enabled. Let me save my scene. This way it'll remember that. Okay. So now, a couple of things. We know we need to start working to get a better result. So one of the tools that we use is this little feature here called the crop. This little crop area will allow us to marquee an area. And when I hit the render button, it will only update this area, which is much, much faster than waiting for the entire scene to render. And the whole idea is you pick an area that has, a lot of noise in it, an area that represents probably one of the noisiest or dirtiest areas in your scene. And that's what we want to work on. Because if you can get this area to look good, when you render the whole thing, everything else will look good. So we can even go smaller than this. Let me stop that. Let's go smaller. Let's just do that bottle. All right, so what am I rendering with? Right, well, this little button right here are your render settings. So when I click on this little button with the gear, that brings up render settings, render using, should say Arnold. You've got Arnold loaded. The comments section lets you know what the size of your render is. Right now, we're not using much of this other information because we're going to render and save our image out of Arnold's render view. So when we get into rendering a sequence, an animation, this is where this is going to be important because we're going to have multiple frames. But we can name everything. We can choose the format right out of Arnold. By default, you're always going to get a single frame. Now, image size, this is how you change it. Under the Arnold renderer, we've got a sampling section at the top. And this is where you're going to spend most of your time adjusting the samples. All right, so what are these doing right here? The camera AA. This is your global sample setting. All of the other parts down here, diffuse, specular, transmission, SSS, subsurface scattering, volume, indirect, volumetric, all of these get multiplied by the camera AA. AA stands for anti-aliasing. Now you say 3, but why, when I see 3 here, does it say 9 up top? This is where it gets to be very Maya and Arnold-like. So when you see 3 here, 3 is not the actual number of samples, it is the square root of the number of samples. So the square root of 9 is 3. 3 times 3 times 3 is 9. Or actually, no, 3 times 3 is 9. I'm out of my mind. Never mind. 3 times 3 is 9. And you say, okay, that makes sense, but why is there 2 down here under diffuse, but yet it says 36? Okay, well, in reality, there are 9 samples for the camera AA. We know that because 3, that's the square root of 9. What is 2 the square root of? Now, if you can't think, I always use my calculator here. So I can go 2. So 2 is the square root of 4. So how do we get 36? Well, this is 9. This is 4. 9 times 4 is what? 36. So that's how they get 36 up here. Notice specular, it's got the same deal, transmission, subsurface scattering. Subsurface scattering is a little bit different because it's got a max on there. Don't worry about that. All right. In all reality, for the first 5 assignments, we're really going to worry about just the camera AA and the diffuse. When we get into materials, we'll start dealing with specular, transmission, and all the others. But all of our scenes, until we hit materials, are going to be flat gray. Why flat gray? We're not distracted by shiny objects or color. If you can light and make your stuff look good with flat 50% gray, you can pretty much make anything look good. So that's how we're going to learn lighting. And that's why we're not worried about the specular or the transmission part. Now, here's the deal. If you increase the camera AA too much, remember it's multiplying all the other sections, you don't necessarily need all of the sections to have that much information. So normally, what we wind up doing is we keep the camera AA 3, maybe 4, maybe up to 6. We hardly ever go above 6 because what we really need cleaned up here is the indirect section, which in Arnold's infinite wisdom, diffuse is indirect light. So camera AA, think of it as direct light and a multiplier. Diffuse, think of that as indirect or bounce light. I need more samples in my bounce light than I do in my overall global. Right. Let's kind of put that into practical terms. So if you take a look at our rendering doc that we have here, I kind of pulled out that information already for you. So if you think of 2 or 3, think of that as preview quality. 4 to 6, that's sort of medium-ish. 8 is high. Same thing on all the other settings. So honestly, what I usually wind up doing is I will put my camera AA on 4. And then maybe bump my diffuse up to 4 also. Now, notice that it gives 4 is the square root of 16. 16 times 16 is 256. That's why the diffuse now gets, even though they both have 4, the diffuse gets 256. So honestly, what I will do is I'll probably leave my camera AA at 4 and then bump this up to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 until I get enough indirect samples to clean this up before I start cranking this up. Because once I start increasing camera AA, it globally multiplies everything. So keep your camera AA somewhere between 4 and 6, and then set your diffuse for between 4 and 8, I would say. Because remember, that's going to get multiplied by this camera AA. So a couple of very useful features in Arnold. Down at the bottom here is a little camera icon that's called a snapshot. What that will do is take a snapshot of what you just rendered and save it. So this is what it looked like when I used the default of 3 camera and 2 diffuse. So let's see what it looks like with 4 and 4. It is going to take a little bit longer to render. Now, if I want to compare, all I have to do is come down here and click in my little saved snapshot area. And notice it turns blue. That's what I'm looking at. When I click again, it's showing me what's live in my render. So you can see the quality difference. Now, is it twice as good? It's better, but it's not really twice as good. And part of the problem with rendering is you would think if I double the samples, I should get double the quality, but you don't. It's diminishing returns. You never get a one-to-one energy transfer in CG. There's always loss. So although you may double the samples, you won't get double the results. You'll get maybe 40% better or 50% better, but it's not going to be 100% better, if that makes sense. Questions? All right, so this is better. Let's keep that. Let's see what it looks like if I crank my diffuse up to 6. Since I've got my renderer running, it's called IPR, it's always going to update unless I stop it. Now, it's going to start to take a longer time. So this little swatch took 1 second to render with default settings. It took 9 seconds with the better settings. And now this one, it took 20 seconds. Notice it's better. Take a look at my samples. I still have 16 for my camera AA, but when I cranked up the diffuse, now I've got a little more than double the 256 samples I had before. Is it twice as good? No, unfortunately. It's better, but not twice as good. Now, what happens if I crank this up to 8? So this took 1 second, 9 seconds, 20 seconds. This little piece is going to take longer than 20 seconds to render. All right, so that took 35 seconds. So how does it compare with default settings? Well, it is a whole lot less noisy. So the difference between 6 and 8 is noticeable, but it's not mind-bogglingly great. Now, at this point, if I throw any more samples at it, I'm still never going to get rid of all that noise. I'm just going to start losing more energy in the transfer. So this is where we would add that post-processor, the denoiser in. And what the denoiser is going to do is render it at this quality and then go through and filter to remove some of that noise. Now, the filter is a very, honestly, the bottom line is the filter is a very sophisticated blur. It's going through and trying to smooth everything out. So let me stop the renderer. Let me open up my display settings, which is this little gear icon. I'm going to add my denoiser noise. Now you'll notice we have one called optics and one called noise. The noise is the one you want to use on a Mac because the optics relies on an NVIDIA graphics card to help denoise it. What kind of graphics cards do we have on the Mac? Most of you probably don't know. You have a NVIDIA? Okay. I would still honestly recommend you use the noise only because it's software rather than hardware specific. And I have used it at home. I got a PC at home, but it doesn't give you quite the same results. So honestly, for our class, keep it on the noise. If you want to, play around on your own, feel free. But for whatever you turn in, just use the noise. Anyway, we have Radeon graphics cards on the Mac. Radeon's a good company, but they do not have any of the fancy, NVIDIA calls it the AI chip, kind of artificial intelligence on how to get rid of noise and how to speed up processing. So optics is for that. We want to use the noise denoiser. Here are the settings down here. There's a patch radius, search radius, and variance. All right, so if you take a look in here, I've got a definition that I pulled out of Arnold or what all these do. So we got a patch radius of 3. That basically is the area that it's the denoising area where they soften the image. And it's that 3 stands for a pixel radius. The search radius is you've got a block of 3 pixels that are part of another block of 3 pixels so that you get a total block of, well, it's basically 3, 3, 3, 3. You basically get 9 altogether. What it does is that's the total area being denoised. So it's got a small area that it reads and softens that's applied to a bigger area. So you've got these little blocks of 3 pixels that are kind of denoised and softened and then filtered in a bigger area. Honestly, the default settings work wonderfully. the variance, this is how much blur is applied. The variance is a balance between how sharp your image is and how much denoise is removed. Honestly, the default provides a really good balance. So with this turned on, if I hit the render button again, what it's going to do is denoise it after it's done rendering. And hopefully you guys can even see that on the projector. Move it down here where it's not in direct light. So like I said, it's going to go through finish rendering and then pause for a second and denoise it. There we go. All right, so this is what it looked like before denoise. Hopefully you guys can see there's still a little noise here, right on the amp, but for all intent and purposes, it's gone here. Before, after. All right, does that make sense? Question? No dumb questions. I just want to make sure everybody's kind of clear on that. And the whole idea is for you guys to figure out, what do I need to do in order to get a decent quality image? Let me render that one more time because I'm going to use this as a guinea pig to output and show you how you get a render when you're done in Arnold out for Photoshop. Now, when you render, whatever is currently in your render view, not any of your saved images, that is the only thing you can save out of Arnold. Like I can't go back to one of my snapshots and save that out. They are only for display in the render view. They're not, I don't know why they did it that way. A lot of different renderers, you can choose which one of your saved renders you want to output, but Arnold, you can't. All right, so let's do that. Let's save it. There we go. Good. Now, before we do that, what I want to do is show you how you bring a reference image in. Because ideally, when you're rendering, you want to know what you want to know is, does my render stack up against the reference? Is it as good, at least as good as the reference? And how do you know that unless you can compare it inside Arnold? So in the Arnold render view, you go File, Open Image. And if you set your project, it'll take you to your project folder. But I want to go to my reference folder, which is part of this little packet that we give you. And I want to find the right image. So this is the same image. Let's take a look at it. There's my reference. So if I compare my reference, and I realize there's the word reference over top, but take a look at the amp and the wall behind it and the radiator and compare. How does my reference look against my render? They look pretty close. Now, if I compare this to something like this, well, that's not going to fly because that's got noise in it. That doesn't. But my render looks pretty good. So this is how you bring reference in, and you can compare your reference or the reference we give you so you know how far to go with your noise. Like I said, I usually start with my camera AA at 4. I'll start my diffuse at 4, work my way up. When I get to a point where I think it's looking pretty good, I'll bring my reference in and start to compare it. Now, suppose this is the final version. We're done. Pretend everything else is just as clean as this. Because honestly, if I sit here and render, we'll have like 10 minutes of watching grass grow or paint dry. So we're going to pretend this is completely done. We want to save it out, bring it into the template, and work on it. So I'm going to go File, Save Multi-Layer EXR. You could go Save Image, but this is a lot safer. Multi-layer EXR, it's going to put it in the images folder. So I'm just going to call it project 1 a day. Shot 4, because I can't think of anything else. You don't need to put in extension, just hit save. And now, if we go to the desktop, go into images, there is our EXR. And it put that EXR on there for you. Now, believe it or not, there is an image outside the window. And if you did not set your Maya project, this would show up as pure white back there. You would not see anything through the blinds. All right. Does the workflow make sense? So now, once you're done with the daytime scene, you basically go ahead and do the same thing for the night. Now, the night, you may find that, well, I've got my camera AAM4, I got my diffuse on 8. It still looks a little noisy because nighttime's going to have a lot more indirect light. There's a lot more artificial lights. They are noisy. There's a lot more indirect light bouncing around. So you may want to try, if you're still noisy with your diffuse at 8, try bumping your camera AA up to maybe 5, maybe 6. I wouldn't honestly go beyond 6. But that'll at least give you some guidelines. All right, questions? So the nighttime scene, you're going to have the same thing, a render camera. You're going to have a bookmarks. You're going to choose the bookmark version that you want to do, which would be one of these shots. And they're going to be basically named with the camera. So this will be 16, 16, 50, 45. So honestly, it's not going to take you long, but give yourself enough time to kind of get a feel for how the rendering works. Camera AA and diffuse are going to be the two main tools you're going to use, along with the crop tool and turning that denoiser imager on. That is really like gold. And the reason I mentioned you got to have at least Arnold 4.2.1.1 is because before that, that imager did not exist. That is new as of this year in February or March. Before that, you just had to crank samples up until everybody got sick. It was a lot of work. They did have a denoiser that you could run once it got done rendering, but it didn't work in the render view. It was really a pain. All right. Let's do a quick little tutorial on camera lenses so we can get an idea of what's going on. So camera lenses, like glasses, they can help you either focus light or disperse light, blur it out or focus it. Now, I guess that would go the same thing for our eyes. You know, wear contacts, it's the same thing. You basically are changing your lens a little bit in your eyes. So there are four main categories of lens types. They have cute names like fisheye, wide angle, normal, and telephoto. All camera lenses are measured from the back of the glass of the lens to the camera sensor. Camera sensors in the body of your camera, and most phones have a focal length that is a wide angle focal length. I believe they're like, most of them by default are 24. It's a 24 millimeter. Now, this first category, the fisheye, is pretty squat and bulbous because it only goes 2.5 millimeters to roughly 15. But notice the top of the camera lens has a spherical shape to it. Very much like the peephole of a door. Look through the peephole of a door. What do you see? Almost a 180-degree view of what's on the other side. It's distorted, but it's designed to give you full field of view almost. That's exactly what a fisheye tries to do. But the thing about a fisheye is it also causes what's called barrel distortion. So this field of lavender in France would normally, if you're taking it with a just normal, average, ordinary camera, it would be a flat line horizon, right? Just like you walk outside, go down to the beach, take a look at the ocean, right? You see that horizon line is pretty flat and vertical or horizontal. So when you introduce curvature in the glass, it kind of takes everything and bends it around. It creates that distortion. It also tends to make objects close to the camera look very big, and objects that aren't really that far away kind of recede into the background. So we are basically shrinking the image onto the camera. Now, honestly, a lot of common lens types that you'll see, if you're a photographer, you go out and buy fixed lenses, which means they are lenses that you don't necessarily, can't really change how they look. You know, it might be something like, you might see like 6 millimeter or 9 millimeter or 12 millimeter. So if you find something like that, your reference sort of has this look to it, it's probably a fisheye lens. Like I said, these are probably the most common types you'll see in that. Now, the next category, this is called a wide angle. This is garden variety, average, ordinary, everyday point and shoot camera. I like to call this the realtor's friend, because most real estate agents will go take a picture of an environment, a room, you know, a house with a wide angle lens because it makes everything kind of look expansive. How many of you saw your apartments or houses online before you moved in? Right? Didn't they look really grand and spacious? And you get in there and you realize it's a shoebox. Oh, 1 foot's in the bathroom, 1 foot's in the kitchen. If I back up, where am I? I'm in the living room. So it's not that it's unethical to do that. They're just trying to make it visually appealing. You can understand. It makes for really great landscape photography because it makes everything look big and broad and open. Now, it does have a slight curvature to the top of the lens. And it goes anywhere from 15 millimeters up to 45. Probably the most common ones you will see is you will see like 16 millimeter. You'll see 24. You'll see 35. You might see 40, 42, 45. Honestly, photographers that go out and buy fixed lenses, which means they are just one type of focal lens, will probably buy one of these, or they'll have all three. And photography can be very expensive like anything. You get into it professionally and there is a specific, object to take care of a specific situation. In this case, lenses are highly, really good lenses are done in a lab in a clean room where everybody wears white and they filter out all the air and they polish everything. They handle everything with gloves, as opposed to, you just stick it in a grinder in somebody's garage and you grind down the lens. So we're still shrinking the image. So a friend of mine took these pictures. This is his 24 millimeter and this is a 16 millimeter. So you can see we get a little bit of that kind of barrel distortion from a fisheye, but not quite as much. Here, this one, we get a little bit of expanse in the hands, a little bit of shrinkage off to the left. And the whole idea is you're looking to make things look more spread out than they would normally look. Now, this right here, that is Maya's default lens. Everything you have in Maya, when you open a brand new scene, perspective, all the ortho cameras, they're all 35 millimeter. So just be aware, you can make your own camera. It's going to be 35 millimeter. You might want to take a look at what your reference looks like and try changing the focal length to match your reference. And I'll kind of show you what that looks like with a real quick demo. All right, so the next one is basically a normal lens, sometimes called a portrait lens. And honestly, the most common lens is a 50 millimeter. You go get your school picture taken, you go somewhere and they're going to shoot a portrait, they're going to be using a 50 millimeter lens. It doesn't shrink, it doesn't enlarge the image, and it gives the most stable, least distorted picture that we can make. And honestly, the reason that came about is because when you're taking a portrait, you don't want to enlarge anybody's facial features, unintentionally, or let's be honest, it's not that flattering if you do that. Nobody wants to see big giant bulbous nose when they really don't have a big giant bulbous nose. It's just a weird lens you're using. Unless, of course, you don't like the person. And a lot of this came from portraits that were painted before there was photography. The whole idea of painting a portrait was to make the subject look very, it was to flatter the subject. Why? Because most of the portraits that you were commissioned to do was done by people who had money. And if they had money, they would pass your name on to somebody else with money and you would make a living at it. Or if you did an actual portrait where you showed, their big honking nose and, all the facial imperfections, you probably wouldn't have much of a career. It's just the way it is. Now, this doesn't stretch, doesn't magnify. Like I said, if you suspect it's a portrait, 50 millimeter. Now, the next telephoto, this can go anywhere from 65 to infinity. Infinite simply means that you are magnifying something really, really, really far away. And how much you magnify, it's going to be based on how big your lens is, or can you even hold that lens or be in the same room with it. So think of like basically a telescope on a mountaintop is nothing more than a really big telephoto lens. It's a big, gigantic set of glass and mirrors and lenses that are designed to magnify things like really far away. Now, part of the problem when you take something really far away and you magnify it, you get what's called lens compression. Now, remember, when we create art, aren't we always taught, rule of thirds, golden mean, foreground, midground, background? You've got overlap. You've got parallax where the back objects don't move the same as the front objects and everything kind of moves around. All right, all of that gets minimized with a telephoto because you're taking something really far away, foreground, midground, background, and all of a sudden everything's flattened out. So what that does, well, we have a building here where we can't tell if those buildings are attached or if there's an alleyway between them, or maybe there's a 2-lane, 3-lane, 4-lane highway in between them. You can't really tell. Now, in sports, it's absolutely a must because you don't want to be on the field where there's harm. You want to be somewhere in a safe distance taking pictures. So, even so, you get overlap here. We got really good overlap of all these players, but we can't really tell how far apart they are. Are they a couple of inches, couple of feet, couple of yards? All of that foreground, midground, background is all squashed together and flat. Now, as artists, our job would be to fill in the gaps there. We want to make sure that we can go back in and create that depth separation. But just be aware, if you've got a shot where it looks like it's, you can see the objects pretty good, but everything looks sort of flat. Think, wow, maybe that's a telephoto lens happening. Does that make sense? Does that help? Now, let's take a quick look in Maya. So what I'm going to do is just draw all over the interface first. And let's create just a brand new scene. So I'm going to create a plane, simple poly plane. I'm not going to render anything, create a couple of spheres. Or cylinders. Nah, I don't like cylinders. Let's go with spheres. And let's get them out of the ground so they sit on top of it. All right, let's duplicate that a couple times. And let's do this with it. Let's see what that looks like. All right, now let's create a camera. So right now I'm in perspective. So yeah, forget that. I'm in perspective. I want to make a camera. So you go up to create cameras, just the plain old, average camera. Forget about aim, forget about aiming up. We're not animating it. We're not having to follow anything. It's a still camera. Now, by default, every time you create something in Maya, where does it get dropped? Every time you create something in Maya, where does it go? Well, it goes in the center of the world, right? In the grid, right? Gets dropped right in the center. So that's where our new camera is here. Now, to look through this camera, first off, I like to go in the outliner and let's rename it. So this is going to be my render cam. And what I want to do is, with it selected, I'm going to go to panels, perspective, render cam, or look through selected. What I want to do is let's just frame this up in our new camera. Now, it would help me a lot if I could visualize when I go to render it, what's it going to look like? Where are my boundaries? Because you can't always rely that you will get this whole thing in your render cam. So what we do is we turn on what is called resolution gate, which is this little white outline around a cyan or blue ball. So turn that on. That goes into your render settings and says, oh, you've got 960 by 540 as your size. This is what your current camera will render like. This is what it will look like. Now, let's go. I'm in the camera. Let me go to view and select camera just to make sure I've got it selected in case I didn't. Because right now it's hard to tell if it's selected when I'm looking through it. Other than it is highlighted, but now I got to reselect it. Go into your attribute editor, and the very second attribute here is called focal length. And there you see 35 millimeter. Now, if I want to change this, well, let's go change it. Let's go 9 millimeter. Let's go fisheye. So I'm just going to type in 9. Now, watch when I go to zoom it in to the same degree that I had it before. Notice that sphere really stretches and elongates. Compare that with, well, let's go back to 35 here. That's what 35 looks like. So 12. If I try and zoom that in right about here, I don't know. Let's try 24. 24, little still just a touch more distorted than 35. Let's try 50. So this is basically a portrait lens. It's really not magnifying or shrinking the image. Let's try 70. All right, so 70, not bad. Let's try 100. 100 would be another kind of version. Let's try 200. Notice that we've got a lot of overlap right here, but compare that with 50. There we go. It feels like I've got distance between them as opposed to 200, where it looks flat. Notice the ball in the back, the ball in the middle, they all appear to be almost the same size as the ball in front. But when I have it at 50, I'm getting a sense that there's depth in there. So that's what I mean by you'll see stuff flatten out when you start using a longer and longer lens. Now, the nice thing is in the camera, so let's go back to, well, let's use 50 as kind of our guide here. So let's go 50. And let's do this. How does that look at 200? Zoom in. Well, let's make 200 our guinea pig then. All right, so that's 200. What I'm going to do is bookmark this camera shot. And now the nice thing about a bookmark is it will bookmark the position of the camera and any other camera attributes like the focal length. So I can go to view, bookmarks, edit bookmarks, because I don't have any created right now. And I can simply go down here, new bookmark. Uh, 200 millimeter. Now, you can't unfortunately use numbers as a first character in Maya. Doesn't like it. So hit apply. Oh, I got to hit enter first. There we go. So let's make this 100. Let's bookmark that. Let's try 70. Try 50. Let's do a 35. Good old Maya. Shoddy. All right. And let's do 24. We'll do one or two more. Now, the reason I'm doing all this is so you can try a couple different camera focal lengths when you're playing around with your reference and see which one works the best. And all I'm trying to do is get the general position of that front sphere in the same spot so I can compare and see what kind of distortion I need or want or don't want. All right, so we got 24. I think I bookmarked that. Yes, I did. Let's do 12. All right, so now I can come in and I can go, all right, well, wow, 200, compare that with 12. Compare that with 35. Compare that with 50. Compare it with 70. You can see what's happening. It's starting to compress. Let's go with 100. Well, I moved that one, but 200. So take a couple of different ones, try some different camera focal lengths, and see what that does to your shot as far as distortion goes. Does that make sense? All for your third part. So in the end, for us, you will be turning in 3 renders. Now, for the MyComp portion, pick whichever template works for you. Daytime, nighttime, doesn't matter. Because what you're going to do is you're going to put your reference and replace our reference in one of those Photoshop templates, which I'm going to show you real quick in a second how to put that in and then just save it out. So you're going to give us, each time you are done one of your Maya scenes, save it, because that will be what you're going to turn into us. What we want is the Maya scene that you use to create your final render from. So when we're taking a look at your images and grading, I can open it up and I can go, what did you do here for quality? And I can open it up and look and see what you did. I also like to look at and open when you do MyComp, because I always like to see what you guys do. Because a lot of people are very creative with what they do. Good, that's done. I figured it would be. There we go. Part 1. Good. All right, so Maya scene template for each of the 3 parts. Now, earlier, I saved out my EXR, and we're going to pretend that that is my final gold standard. This is what I'm turning in for my day scene. So let me go into my Photoshop template. Let's open that up. I'll show you how to bring your image in, and you would bring your reference in exactly the same way. All right, let's do this. All right. So what I'm going to do is I want to open up my render. So I'm going to go File, Open in Photoshop. And of course, Photoshop has no idea where you're at. There we go. Open it up. When you open up an EXR, and one thing I want to stress, don't drop and drag. Don't drag your image and drop it into Photoshop, because it turns it into an object rather than keeping it as a rasterized image. You want to make sure you get the open EXR read options. Make sure alpha channel data is set for as alpha channel. By default, sometimes it comes in as transparency, and that will mean your image outside the window may not show up. So alpha channel data as alpha channel, click OK. It's here. To bring this into the template, the easiest way is to select all, copy, and then paste it. So select A or Command A on the Mac or Control A on the PC, select all, copy, Command C. What I want to do is, let me go down here in my reference images. I'm just going to drop it into this group. So I'm going to go paste, Command V, take my move tool, and now I can move it down here. Now, when you are positioning this image inside Photoshop, zoom in. And in Photoshop, if you do Command plus and minus, it'll zoom in and out real quick. If you're zoomed in and you want to pan around in Photoshop, you could use these slide bars or hold the shift, or sorry, hold space bar down, and that will give you the hand tool, and then you can just kind of move stuff around. All right, so with the move tool, what you want to do is come in and snap it. I've got snap turned on under view, snap, but Photoshop is very weird, and it, based on your level of zoom, it will sometimes look like it snaps, but you zoom in and there's an edge on it. So zoom in, make sure there are no edges, because I'm kind of a stickler for this, I'll be honest, only because it represents how much care you take in your own work. Like if you just throw it in and go, yeah, I'm going to turn it in, that looks awful. Just remember, this could be a job, art test. You want to make sure that everything is perfect. So just zoom in, get it to snap. It should turn pink when it is snapped and lined up, but it's Photoshop. Don't trust computers. They hate humans. All right, so then you come in, take the text tool, change your name, come down. You can always change. Let's cancel that. You can always come down and type in the camera AA. For this, I used 4. Diffuse, I used 8. My variance was 0.25. I didn't change the default. The render time, whatever the render time is you have to get that out of Maya in the render view. Don't forget, in Arnold, it's got the render time at the bottom of the render. On the bottom left. Now, when you go to save this out to deliver to us, you are giving it to us as a targa file, a .tga. A .tga is a good mix between quality and file size. It does not compress as much as JPEG or PNG. It is a much higher quality. The highest quality, obviously, is Photoshop. PSD files don't compress. Photoshop will not compress anything it can't restore to its full size. But for delivery to us, a targa is perfectly good. In fact, targas used to be the darling of the industry until EXRs and HDR images came around. They used to be what was used in compositing. But now everything's EXR, HDR, there's other formats they use now too. Now to save this, go File, Save As. You want to commit, if you made any changes, yeah, commit to your layer, save it. Honestly, what I would do for you guys is save this as a PSD first. This way, if you have to go in and change something, you've got all your stuff in there. Photoshop will maintain layers, targas will flatten them. So let's just call this, there we go. I've got that. Now I want to deliver this as a targa, so I have to go File, Save As again. And in Photoshop, you would just think, oh, format, I can't wait. I don't have a targa here. Why? Well, prior to March of this year, you could. And then Adobe decided, well, let's make it more difficult for everybody to save it as some other format. So what you have to do is click Save Copy. It creates the word copy and then lets you have all the other formats. So choose targa. Let's get rid of that word copy and give it the correct file name. And all that file information naming is inside the activity. Now, when you save it as a targa, you'll get targa options 24-bit. If you save it as 16, it will give you banding in your image, which means you won't get a smooth transition in grays. It'll look pretty nasty. 32-bit is overkill because we're not using red, green, and blue and an alpha channel. We'll get to alpha channels when we get into texture. But 24-bit, perfect, right down the line, garden variety RGB image. Hit save. Let's quit out of Photoshop before my computer explodes. And here is our PSD. If I have to go back in, I can tweak it. But there is my target. And notice you really can't see a difference in the quality between the two. All right. that is pretty much what I have for you guys for today. That should get you going for lab. Like I said, in theory, I think you guys can get a good bulk of this done. You should be able to at least get the day and the night done. And maybe you're not decided about your comp and you can work on that a little bit, but you should be in really good shape. Make sure all your rendering works so Frank and Ari can help you in lab if you have issues. Anybody got any questions?
For adjusting the cameras, we're only going to do that on our third.
On your third composition, yeah, because we provide the other ones for you, and you can get an idea of what they sort of look like with how we use them, but experiment on your own, find out, like just make that simple scene like I did with the spheres. That'll really give you an idea of what's going on with it. And even in your comp, play around with it, like frame up your shot, like you've got all your geometry arranged, frame it up and try a couple different focal lengths and see which one looks better compared to your reference. Like take a guess, start at 35. That's a good place to start. It's default. See what it looks like. Does it need for everything to look a little flatter, or maybe stuff needs to be a little more distorted? You can go from there. Good question. Any others? All right, so I know we ran over a little bit, but you guys will still get an hour. I'm not an over. So let's see, come back to lab at 6:25. And I will end this. Well, let me stop recording.